welcome back to Old Japan's Sleep Stories. You made it through another day. You survived. That's enough. In this quiet little inn, every night I tell bedtime tales. Stories from Old Japan. The meaning of each story changes, depending on who is listening. So now, let your thoughts rest. Come sit by the candlelight. Tonight's story is about a monk who changed the way he looked, hoping the world would change too. But the silence he longed for was filled instead with sharper laughter. It's a story for those who've spent years troubled by some part of themselves. The nose. Ryunosuke Akutagawa. In Ikuno, everyone knew about the nose of Shinchi Naigu. It was about 15 to 18 centimeters long, hanging from his upper lip down to below his chin. Its thickness was uniform from base to tip, like a long, thin sausage dangling right in the middle of his face. Naigu, now over 50, had been troubled by this nose since his days as a novice monk. Even after becoming a high-ranking priest serving Buddha in the inner temple, the worry had never left his heart. Outwardly, he appeared unfazed, not because he thought it inappropriate for a monk to worry about such things. Rather, he couldn't bear for others to know that he was worried. He feared the word nose more than any other in casual conversation. There were two reasons his nose troubled him. First, it was simply inconvenient. He couldn't eat alone. Whenever he tried, the tip of his nose dipped into his rice bowl. So he had one of his disciples sit across from him at meals, holding up his nose with a board about 3 centimeters wide and 60 centimeters long. This arrangement was exhausting for both of them. One time, a young novice filling in sneezed, and his hand slipped, plopping the nose into a bowl of porridge. That incident became the talk of Kyoto. Still, that wasn't what tormented Naigu the most. What wounded him deeply was how this nose hurt his pride. The townspeople of Ikuno considered it lucky that he was a monk. Who would marry a man with such a nose? Some even said he must have become a monk because of it. But Naigu never felt his priesthood lessened the burden of that nose. His pride was too delicate for such surface-level comfort. So he tried, in both passive and active ways, to heal his injured dignity. First, he experimented with making his nose appear shorter. Alone before a mirror, he tilted his face at angles, studying every reflection. Sometimes he'd rest his chin on his hand or touch his jaw, peering with intensity. But never once did the nose look acceptably short. Often, the more he tried, the longer it seemed. Each time he'd sigh, pack the mirror away, and return, reluctantly, to recite the Canon Sutra. He was also obsessed with other people's noses. Ikuno Temple was bustling, with lectures and rituals drawing crowds. Monks' quarters lined the grounds, and the bathhouse steamed daily. Naigu studied every face that passed through. He longed to find someone, anyone, with a nose like his. But his eyes saw only noses, not clothes, not colors. And yet, even among hooked or large noses, none matched his. Each failure deepened his discomfort. Sometimes, mid-conversation, he'd unconsciously pinch the tip of his drooping nose and blush, embarrassed. Eventually, he turned to religious and historical texts. But nowhere did it say Mokuren or Shariputra had long noses. Even great bodhisattvas like Nagarjuna or Asanga had normal ones. Once he read that Liu Bei of Shu had long ears, if only it had been a nose. How comforting that would have been. Though he suffered quietly, Naigu also searched for ways to shorten his nose. He tried everything he could. He drank decoctions of wild gourd. He smeared his nose with mouse urine. But still, the 15 to 18 centimeter nose dangled from his upper lip as always. Then, one autumn, a disciple who had gone to Kyoto returned with a remedy from an acquaintance, a Chinese-born doctor, now a monk at Choraku Temple. As usual, Naigu pretended not to care. He didn't ask to try it immediately. Instead, he casually remarked, "I feel bad troubling you at every meal." Of course, he was hoping the disciple would offer the solution. And the disciple, seeing through the act, felt more pity than irritation. Just as Naigu had hoped, the disciple encouraged him with earnest words. And just as expected, Naigu gave in to the suggestion. The remedy was simple. Boil the nose. Then have someone step on it. The temple's bathhouse had hot water every day. So the disciple drew scalding water into a bucket. But dipping the nose directly risked a steam burn on his face. So he bored a hole into a wooden tray, placed it over the bucket, and lowered only the nose into the hot water. This way, it didn't feel hot at all. After some time, the disciple said, "It should be ready now." Naigu smiled faintly. Hearing that, no one would guess it was about a nose. The steam made it itch like flea bites. When he lifted it out, the disciple began stepping on it. Naigu lay flat, his nose stretched across the floor, watching the disciple's feet rise and fall. Sometimes the disciple would glance down with a pained look and say, "Does it hurt?" The doctor said to press hard. But truly, are you in pain? Naigu tried shaking his head, but being stepped on, his neck wouldn't move. So he glanced at the disciple's cracked heels and growled. It doesn't hurt. It actually tickled, strangely pleasant. Eventually, tiny bumps like millet grains appeared. They looked like a small bird, plucked and roasted whole. Seeing this, the disciple muttered, "He said we should pull these out with tweezers." Naigu puffed his cheeks in displeasure, but let the disciple proceed. He understood the kindness, but still, being treated like an object made him uncomfortable. He wore the face of someone enduring a surgery by a doctor he didn't trust. The disciple plucked small plugs of fat, like bird feather shafts, about a centimeter long. Once finished, the disciple sighed in relief. "We'll boil it once more." Naigu, still frowning, gave a reluctant nod. After the second boiling, they lifted the nose once more. Sure enough, it was noticeably shorter. Now it looked no different than an ordinary Roman nose. Naigu gently stroked it and with visible hesitation peeked into the mirror his disciple handed him. The long nose that had once dangled below his chin. Now it barely clung to his upper lip, shrunken, pitiful. The red patches, likely bruises from the pressure. Surely no one would laugh at this anymore. The face in the mirror blinked back at him with quiet satisfaction. But the relief didn't last. That entire day, Naigu felt uneasy. What if the nose grew back? Even while chanting sutras or eating, he would stealthily reach up and touch the tip, checking. It always sat politely on his upper lip, unmoving. The next morning, he woke early and touched it again. Still short. He hadn't felt this light in years. It was like the joy he felt once after copying the Lotus Sutra for merit. But then, 2 or 3 days later, something changed. A visiting samurai stared at his face with even more amusement than before. He barely spoke, just stared at Naigu's nose. And that young novice, the one who'd once dropped the nose into porridge, passed by him outside the hall. At first, the boy lowered his head, trying not to laugh. But then, unable to hold it in, he burst out in a snort. Even the low-ranking monks, who stood solemn before him, would start chuckling the moment he turned his back. It wasn't just once or twice. At first, Naigu thought maybe his expression had changed. But that couldn't explain it all. Yes, the nose was still the reason. But the laughter sounded different. Before, people laughed discreetly. Now they laughed openly, bluntly. Perhaps it was because the short nose looked more ridiculous than the long one they were used to. But that didn't feel like the whole reason. They never laughed this openly before. He often paused mid-sutra, tilting his bald head, whispering to himself. In those moments, he would stare vacantly at the image of Fugen Bodhisattva hanging nearby. He thought back to 4 or 5 days ago, when his nose still hung long and low. He brooded like a fallen noble recalling days of glory. He simply didn't have the insight to solve the riddle. There are 2 opposing emotions in every human heart. Of course, we all sympathize with others in misfortune. But once someone escapes that misfortune, we may start to feel oddly dissatisfied. To exaggerate, we might even wish to throw them back into the same pit. Without realizing it, we grow a quiet, passive kind of hostility toward them. What Naigu had sensed without understanding was this selfish cruelty in those around him. And day by day, his mood soured. He shouted at anyone and everyone over the smallest things. Even the disciple who had treated his nose became the subject of whispers. They say Naigu-sama is being punished for his worldly greed. What angered him most was that mischievous novice. One day, Naige heard furious barking outside. He stepped out and saw the boy swinging a 2-foot stick, chasing a skinny, long-haired dog around. The boy was chanting as he ran, "Don't get hit in the nose. There, watch your nose." The stick was none other than the one once used to support Naige's nose at meals. Naigu snatched it from the boy and struck him across the face. Since that day, he had come to resent his shortened nose. Then one night, a sudden wind blew through after sunset. The wind chimes atop the pagoda clanged ceaselessly by his pillow. The cold grew sharper. Old Naigu lay awake in his bedding, unable to sleep. His nose itched. When he touched it, he found it swollen, moist, even feverish. Perhaps shortening it had made it sick. With a humble motion, like offering incense, he held his nose and murmured. The next morning, Naigu woke early as always. He stepped onto the veranda. The ginkgo and horse chestnut trees had shed their leaves overnight. The ground gleamed as if blanketed in gold. Frost covered the roof of the pagoda, and the kurin, the 9-ringed finial, shone in the soft light. He lifted the shutters and took a deep breath of crisp air. At that moment, a long-forgotten feeling stirred inside him. He reached for his nose, startled. It wasn't short anymore. It had returned 15 to 18 centimeters, hanging from his upper lip to beneath his chin. His nose had grown back overnight, and with it, the same lightness he'd felt when it was first shortened returned to his chest. Now no one will laugh anymore. He whispered this quietly to himself, letting his long nose sway gently in the autumn morning breeze. Afterward, his nose returned. The monk felt a small, quiet kind of relief. Perhaps it wasn't acceptance, but the moment he stopped trying to change, quietly asking, did this story make you feel it's okay to live with your own flaws just a little? Or do you still wish they disappear completely? If you found this tale enjoyable, subscribing to the channel and leaving a like would greatly encourage this old storyteller. You have done well today. Rest easy and sleep well. Good night.